Good evening. It is April 14th. We are continuing our series looking at faith. And tonight we're talking about two things that are polar opposites. We're talking about rest and we're talking about stress. Trying to experience rest in a very stressed out culture. And I'm certain if I ask the question, how many of you say that you're stressed out? Whether you're an adult or a teenager watching this video, you're probably going to raise your hand. There is an article from the USA Today, and I'll try and have the link in the description box for you to look at. I'm just going to read a little bit from it. But it's titled, Teens Feeling Stressed and Many Are Not Managing Well. It says teens across the United States are feeling high levels of stress that they say negatively affect every aspect of their lives, a new national survey suggests. More than a quarter, 27%, say they experience extreme stress during the school year, and 34% expect stress to increase in the coming year. Stressors range from school to friends, work, and family. Later on it says, findings on more than 1,000 teens and almost 2,000 adults suggest that unhealthy behaviors associated with stress may start early and continue through adulthood. The report warns that teens are at a risk of a variety of physical and emotional ills and potentially shorter lifespans than their elders if they don't act to reverse their current trajectory. As a result of stress, 40% of teens report feeling irritable or angry, 36% nervous or anxious, a third say stress makes them feel overwhelmed, depressed, or sad. Kristen Race, author of the book Mindful Parenting, says teens are generally honest about responding to confidential surveys. They're more honest in that situation than telling their parents how stressed they are, she says. When teens report their own level of stress, it is typically much higher than parents would report of their teens' level of stress. Again, her book is called Mindful Parenting, and it's Kristen, Kristen, and then Race, Race. If you're interested in getting that book, I would say that's a good read. But many of us already know this, though. Stress is a familiar experience for many, if not all of us. But where does it come from? One definition of stress is the experience of mental or emotional tension caused by demanding circumstances and people. And I think that word demanding says a lot about our experience. Because life makes demands on us. It shows up in categories. It shows up uninvited. It shows up asking you to deliver or to perform. And your heart might start to wonder, what will become of me? So, where does stress surface for you? Is it at school or is it at work? Pressures to perform on your job or, pressures to perform academically or athletically. Is it homework, the long hours of work, or even work when you get home, if you're working at a 9-to-5 job sometimes? Is it the need to prepare for college, SAT prep or ACT prep? Or, even if we're an adult and we're working, sometimes we want to go for that master's or, we want to try online schooling again. So we add these additional things to our list, because we feel like we're always facing some sort of evaluation. So maybe it's, work or school. Maybe it's stress at home. Maybe it's expectations of our spouse or expectations of parents. We feel like we don't measure up to what they want, that maybe they're frustrated with us, that maybe their standards are unclear. And maybe it causes fights. If you're a teen, maybe you're fighting with your siblings. And then you have stress in friendships and relationships. You have conflict. Maybe you have friends with two different groups who don't really get along with each other. Maybe you have burdens of managing your friend's sin and rebellion. One of the worst things I can remember is always having to hide or lie for my friends. Don't tell my parents, or if my mom asks you, tell them I said this. And then you have the up and down of the romantic feelings when you're in middle school and high school. You have the disappointment, you have the heartbreak. Life begins to feel out of control, and we don't like the way that feels. And Jesus had a lot to say about fear and anxiety and our desire to control every aspect of our lives. And one of the main stories we're going to look at is actually in Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 22. It says, "And he said to his disciples, Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." So, what are some of the reasons that we experience stress? And Jesus actually begins to kind of address them here. The first thing we kind of stress out about is provision, or, will I have enough? And you kind of see that here in verse 22 through verse 30 that I just read. What are some of your favorite things? What are some of the things that you feel like you can't live without? Take a couple seconds. Think about some things. How many of you had any of these items in your mind? Whether it was water, food, shelter, or clothing. The crazy thing is we don't even get stressed out about the right things today, because we have high expectations for what life will provide us. We tend to get worried about things that aren't really basic survival. But see, food and clothing are big deals in our culture. What will you wear in the first century was a matter of basic life necessity. Today, we have different stresses about clothing. Think about advertisements. How many advertisements focus on food and clothing? And what is that message? You can't live without these things. You need them. And if you don't have them, there's something wrong with you. But from the first century to the 21st century, in this passage, Jesus is getting at what we sense we think we need. He's getting at the stress and the anxiety that we experience about whether or not is there going to be a provision for us? Are we going to have enough? Because that's the stress. And worry steps in and kind of makes you an offer, but it doesn't really add up. And Jesus talks about kind of that futility of worry. In verse 25 and 26, it says, "And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you're not able to do a small thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest?" See, worry, anxiety attempts to fix things by worrying. If I can just run it over in my mind one more time. Worry tries to take control of the situation to assess the damages, but that's not the way the world works. And Jesus tries to say this in verse 27 and 28 of Luke 12 here. "Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? Then he says, consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? So creation, animals and plants, know that they are cared for. But is that really how we run? How you and I operate? Is that how we spend our efforts? Are we calm? Or are we frantic and frightened? Where does this fear come from? Notice what Jesus says in verse 23 of Luke chapter 12. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. We're going to experience anxiety about what we define as life. When we're stressed out, it's because we've taken all of life and we've squeezed it into one category of need. Life's going to be over if I don't have my phone. Life's going to be over if my friends don't like me. Life's going to be over if I can't get good grades. This introduces our second reason for stress, and it's really people and the performance. Will they think I'm enough? And we're going to look at a different story in the same chapter, just the story that begins our chapter here in verse 1. But we live in what's been described as really an achievement society. From our earliest years, we've probably been told you can be anything you want to be, and that sounds nice, but a lot of times that can come with an expectation, and it's this expectation of you better become something great. But what happens when you realize that you're maybe not all that hot? Or what happens when you face that reality? Because another feature of our world is that everything gets posted on social media. So we're constantly managing the online version of ourselves, and that doesn't always match up with the reality of ourselves. And this chapter here in Luke chapter 12 begins with Jesus warning his disciples about the Pharisees and the danger of hypocrisy. So Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 1, it says, in the meantime, when so many thousands of the people had gathered together that they were trampling one another, he began to say to his disciples, first, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Nothing is covered up that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Therefore, whatever you have said in the dark shall be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in private rooms shall be proclaimed on the housetops. There can be this disparity between a performance that you manage to pull off and who you really are. And we start acting, we start wearing masks. It's a very stressful experience. One of my favorite documentaries is a documentary called Jim and Andy, and it tells the story of Jim Carrey. And Jim Carrey's playing the role of Andy Kaufman in the movie Man on the Moon. But Jim Carrey is a method actor. And what I mean by that is he takes on this persona whenever he performs on a stage. And it's like he lost himself playing Andy Kaufman in Man on the Moon. Like I said, he takes on a persona whenever he performs on stage. And at one point in an interview, he actually says, I'm not Jim Carrey anymore. I just use his name. That's the mailing address. And if you've seen a movie with Jim Carrey, you kind of understand his acting. And maybe you start to piece this together like, oh, I can see that now. But why do we do this? Why do we create these personas? And it's because people's opinions about our performance stress us out. We face evaluation. There's a Christian author by the name of Edward Welch who wrote, any occasion for evaluation can be stressful. If you listen to this type of stress, it whispers, life is risky. Your most treasured dreams rise or fall on your performance. But is failure really that bad? If someone doesn't think you're great, will life rip apart at the seams? Again, you aren't sure, but you don't have time to consider it. Anxiety and fear prefer to stay on the surface rather than linger to consider something more deeply, and you are too busy anyway. If you think about these things, you'll just get farther behind. But notice how Jesus speaks to this in verse 11 of Luke chapter 12. And when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourself or what you should say. And I feel like if there was ever a moment where performance was demanded of you, this is it. But what's at stake? Jesus presents this worst case scenario in verse 4. He says, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body and after that have nothing more that they can do. He's basically saying, don't be worried about how you're going to perform, because life is more than just defending yourself. It's more than having an answer. It's more than being shown to be someone. It's more than escaping ridicule or critique. Don't be anxious, because life is more than a physical life. What is the remedy for stress? Some people might suggest everything from breathing techniques to yoga, and those aren't necessarily bad things. In fact, those are very helpful. But how do you cope with stress? Where do you go? What do you do? It's easy to go to some escape, maybe some unhealthy way of coping. But do you go to God? Because that's where Jesus directs us to go at the end of this in verse 30 through verse 32. In Luke chapter 12, it says, for all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. And in verse 32, he says, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. He calls us little flock. It's almost a humbling description. It's the shepherd who pays attention to the need of the sheep, and the sheep just follow him. You don't need to be impressive. You don't need to constantly perform and achieve. Yeah, we have responsibilities. We have deadlines. We have things to turn in and people to care for. But we don't need to perform more than sheep. We don't need to be more than a child of God. And my challenge to you is, if you're stressed out, go to God. Because there's only one way that you're made to function. You weren't intended to live life without Him. So do you pour your heart out before God? Do you create conversation with Him about what worries you, what stresses you out, what makes you anxious? Because here's the second remedy for stress, is you got to know what your future holds. See, worry is future oriented. When we're worrying, it's one of the few times that we're thinking about the future. Edward Welch, again, also said, worriers are visionaries minus the optimism. An experienced worrier can go for days leapfrogging from past to future and back again, never landing in the present. When they travel into the future, they see it in technicolor and vivid detail. You can see everything going wrong. You can see yourself failing an exam, forgetting your lines in a play, messing up a dance routine, showing up wearing the wrong thing. You see your friendships falling apart, your parents' disapproval. But what does your future hold? And I'm going to kind of close with this in verses 32 through 34 of Luke chapter 12. It says, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus can say, sell your possessions and give to the needy, because your hope is not in these things. There is a bright future if you value what matters most. The problem is that doesn't sound reassuring to us. We want something else. We want certainty. We want provision. But notice what he says. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And we're going to experience concern about what we treasure. God hasn't promised an A on that test. He hasn't promised to fix everything in your relationships. He hasn't promised a home setting that is without conflict or disagreement. but God has promised to give you his kingdom. And so your future in that aspect is incredibly bright. And so my challenge to you this week as a family, especially as you guys go through these questions together tonight, be concerned about what matters most. And I'll see you guys next week.